Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss with the Center for American Progress. With me today is my colleague and co-host of Foreign Entanglements, Rob Farley. Rob, how are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Pretty good. How's the weather in Kentucky? Is it really hot and humid as it is here in D.C.?
No, it's actually about 75. It's quite delightful. And my office is
That's
so cold. My office is so cold because they only really have two settings in my building, warm and cold.
Warm, yeah.
And so they have it on cold right now, and so I'm actually wearing a sweater and a hat.
Ah, I am not. Anyway, so today we're talking about a few things. We're going to talk about the current fighting in Gaza, or the current bombing of Gaza by Israel, and rocket attacks by Hamas and other factions from Gaza into Israel. But also, we're going to get toward the end. We'll get into a discussion of the ongoing Dick Cheney, or Dick and Liz Cheney, I should say, because they're a duo act.
Right.
And Rand Paul, the fight between those, which is an interesting, I think, pretty obviously an interesting fight, but within the GOP over foreign policy.
Right. The intra-GOP fight has always been a concern or an interest of this program. Right. It's always been something that's fascinating.
That's right. So first, Gaza. I was actually over there about a little over a week ago. Came home. So I was there with my family just for the 2 weeks leading up to, and we literally got out. We flew out about 24 hours before the rockets started coming toward Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and elsewhere. I was there when the three hikers were found, or the three hitchhikers, excuse me, the three teenage boys. The bodies were found. And over the next few days, things really started to get ugly. First of all, with roving gangs of Jewish Israelis out looking for Palestinians to attack and finding them in many cases. And in one particularly horrific case, a Palestinian teenager, Mohammed Abu Qadir, kidnapped and burned to death, apparently burned alive. And then after that, an American Palestinian boy, Muhammad's cousin, Tariq Abu Qadir, beaten during a protest pretty severely by Israeli police. And all of that continuing to step-by-step escalate into more intense rocket attacks and then Israeli strikes.
Now, sort of, how did that? I mean, we obviously know where we got to, right? But along the way, was there a sense of certainty that we were going to arrive here with both parties going at it like this, or were there sort of clear? Did it seem like there were clear off ramps along the way? I mean, I guess one thing that's come to light is that the Israelis understood that the three teenagers were dead probably before they started looking for them.
Yeah. Well, no, I think it was very clear from what I've heard from Israeli sources that they were almost certain that they were dead. There was a gunshot heard, at least one in the emergency phone call that was placed by one of the teenagers after they realized they had been kidnapped. They had received no demands. They'd received no communications from the kidnappers. So a large preponderance of the evidence said to the Israeli authorities that these boys were dead. But nonetheless, Netanyahu used the pretext of a search for these three boys while telling the Israeli public that they were alive to just carry out this broad crackdown against Hamas in the West Bank, jailing several hundred Palestinian activists, some of whom with only the most tenuous connections to Hamas, and I think about 50 to 60 of whom had been released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal,
right?
All of which served to very effectively provoke Hamas. You have, all during this time since 2012. So then, the last time we did this in Gaza, there was a ceasefire brokered by Egypt, then under the authority of Mohammed Morsi. Since then, Hamas has largely, not entirely, but largely ceased its own rocket fire from Gaza. You had other groups, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Committees, and others who would fire these rockets from time to time. But I think you would get, from Israeli security sources, you get a recognition that Hamas had effectively enforced this ceasefire. And it's worth noting, and this is very rarely reported in the U.S. press, is that you have pretty regular incursions and violations of the ceasefire by the Israelis as well. Right. Whether we're talking about actual incursions into the Gaza Strip or a refusal to ease the closure on Gaza as was promised by Israel in the ceasefire. So it's not as if these provocations were only going one way, but you have a kind of just a kind of steady status quo that doesn't involve a massive conflagration, even though one side is clearly getting the way shorter end of the stick, and that would be the Palestinian side.
Right.
But here, I mean, you have a situation where Netanyahu felt pressure, but also decided to essentially kick the hornet's nest by carrying out this crackdown.
And so was Netanyahu's hope that they would be able to essentially undercut the unity government at the knees and drive Hamas back into Gaza effectively? Was that what's going on here?
I think it's hard to say for sure. I think that's a fair analysis. He obviously jumped on this. They've offered constantly, immediately insisting that Hamas was responsible. Having produced no hard evidence that Hamas was responsible, I don't think we'll ever see hard evidence. And to be fair, it's it's kind of like there is a sort of standing order amongst Hamas cells in the West Bank. It's like whenever you can cause trouble. But I think there had been kind of a pullback from that in the wake of the unity government. Right. From the information I've seen and people I spoke to when I was over there, it seems that the guys who are suspected of having carried out these kidnappings were a particularly extreme and uncooperative faction associated with Hamas. So I think it's possibly the case that you have this extreme group that that didn't like the reconciliation agreement, because in fact the reconciliation happened largely on Fatah's terms. Right,
and undertook a predictable set of a set of behaviors that would lead to a predictable outcome.
Exactly. Yes, we have an extremist group acting in extremist ways to destroy or make life very difficult for moderates.
Right. So. Right now, and I don't know if you saw the news, but apparently an Israeli civilian has been killed by rocket fire. I mean, just to keep us topical, and Netanyahu has apparently released a statement that discussed how the broad measures would be taken. Where are we going to be going with this? I mean, is this going to lead to the ground invasion, or is it going to, are going to be heavier air attacks, or what sort of steps do you see us moving forward now?
Well, it's clear that Netanyahu really does not want a ground invasion. I think the pressure on him is especially after the death of an Israeli civilian. I mean, and I think it is worth mentioning we've got I think it's over 150, maybe getting close to 200.
Yeah, I thought it was 180, 189 or something along those. Yeah.
Palestinian civilians, or Palestinians killed, some of them clearly Hamas people, we're not sure how many, but definitely dozens and dozens and dozens of civilians, men, women, children, elderly, killed in Israel strikes. And now we're going to have one Israeli civilian killed because Iron Dome has done a fantastic job. Their Iron Dome rocket and missile defense system has done a fantastic job in protecting Israeli cities. But now that one Israeli civilian has died from these attacks, Israel will use this to, will be pressured to really take the gloves off.
Now, Ted Postal and others have sort of brought up some questions about how fabulously the Iron Dome has actually functioned, right? Whether it's first, I mean, setting aside whether it's economical, but whether the kill vehicles are actually being hitting the warheads, and sort of brings up the questions, right? Are passive countermeasures really what is reducing the death toll or limiting the death toll in Israel? I mean, the rocket fire never killed that many people in Israel, and it's clear that Iron Dome has reduced that, but it's reduced a pretty small number to a smaller number. So.
Yeah, no, I've seen some of that, and again, but I think there's a number of things that are interesting about that. But one is, as you said, the cost of each kill vehicle. I mean, it's in terms of it, at least incurring costs, which is part of a kind of guerrilla insurgent terrorist strategy, whatever term you would like to use, that's, straight down the line, incur much, much greater costs on the part of your enemy than you yourself, right?
Right, exactly.
So yeah, I think at this point with the ceasefire, and I think people should take a look at the ceasefire, and honestly, I want the fighting to stop immediately. I'm happy with anything that ends, this fighting that ends the destroying of homes and killing of human beings. But the ceasefire that I read, the copy that was going around last night, it gave Hamas absolutely nothing, and it's kind of the kind of a standard of diplomacy that you've got to give both sides something to get an agreement. Right. I think people can rightly say that Hamas, was, Hamas chose to launch the missiles. It's true. No one forced them to do that, but at the same time, no one forced Netanyahu to take to undertake the provocations that he undertook as well. So I think clearly there's blame on both sides here, and therefore both sides have some claim to get something from a ceasefire. I mean, if we're going to go back to a status quo that overwhelmingly benefits Israel, which is what the current draft that I saw, that was what it offered. It's not difficult for me to understand how Hamas could have said no, as it appears they did.
Now, how is this playing out, to your knowledge? How is this playing out in the politics of the West Bank right now?
Well, I mean, you've got some Fatah leadership who are always sort of pleased to see Hamas getting beat up. Mm-hmm. I think that's, unfortunate and short-sighted in that Palestinians are dying, and if you're claiming to be the leader of the Palestinian, part of the leadership of the Palestinian movement, you shouldn't be celebrating that. Mm-hmm. I think there's also an understanding among many in the leadership in the West Bank is that this is what Hamas has got right now. Is rockets. I think we shouldn't overstate the extent to which they are isolated and weak. I think Mark Perry has a good piece in Foreign Policy today where he kind of takes issue with the conventional wisdom being that Hamas is on the brink of collapse. Mm-hmm. People say this all the time. And yet there they are. I think they're just, any understanding of the situation requires a recognition that as kind of condemnable and abhorrent. Personally, I find a lot of Hamas's policies and ideology. Mm-hmm. They're an ingrained part of the Palestinian polity. I mean, they have deep roots in this, and they have to be dealt with in some way.
Right.
More than just bombing them every couple of years. But I think especially amongst kind of younger leadership, some of whom are part of the official leadership and some of whom aren't, they understand that for the Palestinian national movement to move forward, there needs to be unity. And to the extent that this undermines the reconciliation government and the potential for unity in elections, as it almost certainly does, mm-hmm. that's just completely negative.
Now, it goes without saying that right now, this dispute is not the only going concern in the Middle East, right? The Syrian mm-hmm. civil war continues. The Iraqi civil war has re-erupted. Jordan is concerned about the spread of ISIS and ISIL. I mean, is this playing out because of that? Is this sort of playing out in regional isolation? Is this, or have there been, or do you expect greater regional effects from the latest eruption of the conflict?
I mean, I think there's no question that the region is, each of these countries is deeply involved in their own affairs. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the Sisi government consolidating power, the Syrians with their civil war, mm-hmm. the Iraqis. But I think there is a sort of baseline, there's a baseline significance to this conflict. For a number of reasons. One of the role that kind of it plays in the kind of grand story that people in the region have about Western intervention and Western interference and colonialism,
right.
Which, like it or not, that is the context in which they continue to view Israel. Mm-hmm. There's also just Jerusalem, the significance of Jerusalem, which despite what you would hear from the right wing, is not something that the Palestinians just invented. Jerusalem is a significant place for Muslims,
right?
And much more so for Palestinians. I mean, it's had long been an economic and social center, but for Muslims more broadly. So yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that we just haven't seen this sort of activism. Or mobilization around this particular iteration of the conflict as we have in the past. Mm-hmm. But it just kind of gets added to the pile of grievances, and that's no good.
Right. I mean, is there... And I think Avigdor Lieberman came out sort of what was effectively a statement that was pro-ground invasion. Is there any upside for Israel to move back into Gaza and to forcibly evict or destroy Hamas? Right. I mean, it seems like Netanyahu thinks it's a terrible idea. It seems like everybody thinks it's a terrible idea, except a certain sector of the Israeli right. I mean, is there a logic for them sort of outside of just spitballing? Is Lieberman just spitballing, or is there a real argument?
I seem to think that he's just spitballing. I mean, he's not like a super genius, but he's smart politically, and he understands that there's value in kind of taking a hard line that no one will ever do, right?
Right.
So if Bibi doesn't do it, he can, for the next few years, always be like, well, I wanted to go in and take Hamas out.
Right.
And like whispering on the side, thank God they didn't do that.
Right.
We've gotten blamed for the huge disaster and the fact that we're now, entirely reoccupying Gaza. But I mean, just as an aside myself, I mean, I only see one benefit, and it's not a benefit that comes close to outweighing all the costs and negatives of a quote-unquote reoccupation, but it would just be an awareness and a recognition that Israel does in fact occupy Gaza.
Right.
Which is the case now. It's not, they do not occupy it as they did before, but they still, by any definition of occupation, they control its borders, they control its airspace, they control the seas, they control entrances and exits, apart from the Rafah crossing, which is controlled by Egypt. They enter Gaza with impunity whenever they want. There's just no other way. Maybe it's an occupation minus, but they are still the sovereign of Gaza.
Right. Right. By almost, yeah. But I think by there's under any conception of international law that would be Gaza's not sovereign in any sense. So.
Right.
Well, I mean, just to. Not to exactly change the subject, but to move on a bit. I mean, I guess before this start, because your trip started before this started. I mean, what were you gathering? What did things feel like before? I mean, were you there before the kidnapping of the three?
No,
you
got
weren't.
There
so
about a week and a half, 2 weeks after.
So you were. I mean, we were firmly into crisis mode by the time you arrived in.
Right. Yes.
In Israel,
the West Bank crackdown had been ongoing for a week and a half. 2 weeks. So, people were definitely tense. There was always, the news and the headlines and the stories. Where are they? And again, I really have to, it's really something for a government to, I mean, let's just step back and recognize it's really something for a government to kind of do that to a population.
Right.
I understand, I guess, on the one hand, why you wouldn't want to release information that might jeopardize any search, but on the other hand, to run this entire social media campaign, hashtag bring back our boys, when you were almost sure that they were dead, seems to me extraordinarily.
Right. I mean, I'm not that familiar with the situation, but there's, to my understanding, there's a similar event just happened in Calgary, where there's a missing family of three, and they haven't been missing long, but the Calgary police have determined that they are most likely dead, and has sort of been very forthright about that.
Yeah.
It seems, especially in a situation like this, it seems the responsible activity is to increase public information rather than use it as an excuse to settle scores, right, or as an excuse to dismantle a particular sort of network. I mean, and that seems especially true given, the very unusual relationship of Israel with its citizens, right, in terms of hostage faking and bodies of hostages taken and released and so forth. It seems a bit much to maintain these expectations for a while when you really knew that things were going to end up the other way. And there has to be some anger about that, right? I mean, I guess it would seem there'd be some anger about that from the Israeli public.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of the anger I've seen, though, has been directed at the Palestinians.
The Palestinians, right.
You have, people on the left, progressives, and others who are pointing out, and I think even some in the center who are pointing out what a cynical move this was by Netanyahu and his government. But by and large, the focus was on, and I understand this, the fact that these boys were taken and killed, and anger at the people who did that.
Now, and you're in Washington D.C. and you follow this much more closely than I do. I mean, you follow all of these issues much more closely than I do. How has the reaction in groups in the United States who are particularly interested in the region, so especially Jewish groups, but also Islamic groups, how has the reaction in the U.S. played out any differently than what we might expect so far? Has there been any cleavage in sort of American Jewish response to the campaign?
Not really that I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you can see. I mean, I think there's a lot more, in terms of the information that's getting out there. I think this is something that's been increasingly true over the past few years. Is thanks to social media, thanks to the web, thanks to Twitter, that people who are inclined to go and find it have much greater access to real reporting on the ground, so they can get a much more accurate picture of what's happening. But in terms of establishment groups, it seems pretty much the same old thing. Defend Israel, stand with Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself. There's very little recognition or acknowledgement that the Palestinians might have a need to defend themselves against a 47-year military occupation. But that's how this conversation works in D.C. I think you have groups who are trying to kind of offer more historical context. I think I'm part of a panel tomorrow at New America Foundation that will be discussing some of these issues. So I think you see a broader array of voices. I think that one of my questions is, at what point do you actually see this change reactions on the Hill in Congress? And for the most part, that those reactions have been extremely disappointing. I would take a moment here to just talk about this young American Palestinian boy, Tariq Abu Qadr, who was beaten savagely on video by Israeli policemen. I attended his hearing in Jerusalem the Sunday we were there, so that's I think the 6th, July 6th. And just complete. I mean, his family has not been contacted by either his member of Congress or his senators from Florida. There was an article in the Hill newspaper today by Tariq's cousin, I believe, who went to visit Tariq's Congresswoman, Kathy Castor, and was treated very rudely by her staff. It's just extremely shocking, and I don't think there's any question that the response and the treatment and the reaction from this office would have been very different if this were an American Jewish kid who was beaten up by Palestinian police.
Right.
I don't think there's any serious doubt. But unfortunately, American politics being what they are, you can have this outpouring of sympathy for and deservedly for the three boys who were kidnapped and murdered. But very little, nothing approaching that for Mohammed, who was kidnapped and burned to death, or anything approaching that for Tariq, who was beaten, on video. There's no question. It's not an alleged thing. I mean, it's right there in color. This kid handcuffed, lying limp on the ground, and these two masked adult men beating the crap out of him.
Unless we can come back to this, but do you want to take this opportunity to segue a bit into a conversation about American politics? Because I guess this is one where, we have yet, as you suggest, to see significant cleavages, even between the parties on broader Israel-Palestine questions. But there are related issues that we obviously do see strong, and related Middle East issues that we do see strong cleavages between the parties, and then also some intra-party cleavages. And I know you've been following, as I think some people have, sort of the big intra-party cleavage in the Republican Party over a hawkish foreign policy, which doesn't happen on this issue, but is nevertheless going to have implications for Israel-Palestine, and depending on how it plays out. So. I guess what are your thoughts on how we're going? Which direction we're moving there?
Sure. I think the most immediate thing is this ongoing, kind of slap fight between the Cheneys, Dick and Liz, America's sweethearts, Dick and Liz Cheney, and Senator Rand Paul as the kind of most, the guy who's kind of the standard bearer, but there are others like Justin Amash and others kind of around this non-interventionist, and I won't use the word isolationism because that it's kind of this slur that's thrown around. I think Justin Logan from Cato has written very well on this. I've written about this. The idea that Rand Paul, I don't agree with him on a lot, but the idea that he's an isolationist, just is to define the term completely out of existence.
Right.
I've said before, and I think it continues to be true, that Rand Paul, is fine with a level of global engagement and leadership that actual isolationists would find just mind-bogglingly imperialist.
Right.
But you have this interesting thing, like over the past few weeks, you've had Dick and Liz emerge from under their rock or their cave or wherever they hang out, trying to undertake this basically a exhuming whatever we want to call it, neoconservatism or just George W. Bush first term interventionism.
Right.
They have this big piece in the Weekly Standard defending the decision to invade Iraq, and it's just, you talk about creating their own reality. I mean, it's just Exhibit A in how it just seems completely detached from this plane of existence.
All right. Did you see? I think it just came out today or maybe yesterday, but I saw it today. The comment that, and I guess it was off the record, but that Vice President Cheney had spoken to some bankers about the potential. If it had been up to him, they would have invaded Iran and Iraq at the same time.
Yes. Right. So
just met with dumbfounded silence.
Right. Yeah, so which is, shorter Dick Cheney, if I had had it my way, it would have been 10,000 American troops killed rather than just, 4,800. And it boggles the mind. Really? That's the lesson you draw. We should have gone bigger.
Right. I guess in terms of, and of course I'm one of Senator Paul's constituents, in terms of how this conflict is playing out, it's been really interesting for me to follow. Over the past few weeks, the neocons seem to have had the mic, or they've had the conch for a bit because of how obviously how the situation in Iraq has been playing out. Right, that this is sort of in their wheelhouse in a way that it's not in the Paul faction's wheelhouse, right? That they get to complain a lot about how Iraq is playing out while
how Obama lost Iraq, right?
Right. Well, the Paul faction doesn't really have an answer to this, right? They don't necessarily have a dog in this fight, other than to say, well, we should have got out. But that puts them too far on the side of Obama, and so it's much more wise, given sort of the realities of Republican politics, just not to comment on these questions. Yeah. It will be interesting to see, how this continues to change over the next couple of years, but also especially in the midterms, right? How many of the Senate candidates swear fealty to the one side or the other? Right.
No, I think Liz Cheney's abortive Senate run was an interesting marker there. But and the failed attempt to knock off what's his name in North Carolina? I'm blanking.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I also don't remember the name, but I know who you're talking about.
But also, what's really interesting, and this is actually something I sort of just threw out there as soon as Cheney showed up again, and I think it's proven to be true. It's like when sure, bring up Iraq. Let's debate that, because when the American public hears about Iraq, all it reminds them is we're really glad to be out of Iraq.
Right.
That's, as I see it, it's not like there is going to be any major reassessment of, the consensus, which is fairly strong, which is that it was a mistake. It was not worth, the costs were not, didn't come close to outweighing any benefits. It was a bad idea. And to have Dick Cheney, of all people, making this argument.
Right.
Hey, yes, go for it. That's a great idea.
In that sense, the Obama administration is probably quite pleased to see some of the chief neoconservatives, Wolfowitz and Cheney and so forth, leading the charge on this. I mean, it allows them to put an absurdist tone on the on the critique that's coming in. The critiques, which are there's certainly a legitimate statement to be made. There are legitimate voices of critique, but at the same time, it's great that Dick Cheney is the primary one, and
absolutely.
And the Weekly Standard is sort of bearing his standard, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't be more pleased with that.
Right.
So Dick and Liz have started this new organization. I forget what it's called, but I would bet a dollar that it's got strong in the title. Because they're very strong.
The Organization for the Strong Heritage of Protecting Democracies?
You know, the strongening of America.
Protecting enterprising democracies?
Protecting foundation for the enterprising strongening of America.
Right, because if there's anything, if there's anything else the right needs, it's another alphabet, another 3-letter acronym, so they can get out, more interns and feed more interns into the congressional machine.
That's right.
I mean, it's actually a fabulous organizational strategy. It's worked very well for that wing of the Republican Party, but there would seem to be some limits someday. One would hope. So yeah, no, I mean, I guess it will be interesting. Again, from Kentucky, it's particularly interesting not only because Senator Paul is one of my senators, but also Senator McConnell, who I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about his opponent than many are. But everybody's predicting that he'll be returned and he may be majority leader. If the Republicans do take the Senate, McConnell's behavior will be very interesting because he's never he's always been regarded as a chameleon on these issues, right? One who doesn't really regard foreign policy as that important, but sort of is willing to tack to whatever wind. And so it'll be interesting to see which direction he feels the wind is blowing.
Right. But just to get back to the inter-GOP fight, I mean, this is part of I'm working on an article about this right now, but I think it is worth keeping in mind that even though you have this fight ongoing, it is worth recognizing how massively outgunned the kind of non-interventionist wing remains, both in terms of money, but also in terms of personnel. So if something very, very strange happened and we ended up with a Rand Paul presidency,
it's not obvious who would staff it, right? I mean,
I do think it's almost certain that he would end up having to dig into the AEI bench and all these other, which would be very, very interesting. Right.
No, you would have. It would be. I'm not saying that it would be worth it happening to see how it would play out, but it would be very interesting. It would be a very interesting development to see what the new best and brightest looked like on the Republican side. Because, I struggle to come up with anybody. He could completely denude Cato, and wouldn't begin to fill the spots that he needs to fill, and wouldn't have the expertise that he needs, right? And so, what's he going to do? Go to nonpartisan think tanks? Anything? No, it seems very difficult.
But I think that gets to the challenge, right? Is that for these sorts of kind of tendencies, ideological dispositions to gain, you need to be president first, right?
Right.
To kind of gather this clique, coterie, whatever word you want to use, of experts around you who could then go forth and multiply.
Right. Right. And I don't really get that sense of organization building from Paul yet, right? I mean, he's always been very successful in a number of ways, and there are probably people who are closer, sort of closer to his organization in Washington and closer to his campaign here in Kentucky who have a better sense. But I don't get the sense of organization building, especially around foreign policy, from his campaign yet. Yeah. But I could be wrong. There could be something going on, sort of beneath the waves that I'm not sort of fully. That would also be an interesting thing, right? Having sort of a genuine Paul partisan on at some point, whether here in Kentucky or somewhere else. But that would be a good idea for us in the future to do. Yeah. All right. Well, I know. Do you have any more thoughts?
I'm tapped.
All right. Well,
I've given you my best, man.
Well, for Entanglements viewers, thank you so much for watching us today. We hope that, again, it's been informative and helpful and allowing you to navigate the day's events. And we also, I think Matt and I both deeply hope for peace between Israel and Palestine in the near future.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right. Talk to you soon.